on the chat?
Olá, boa noite a todos, a
Hello,
todas.
good evening, everyone. It is my honor to welcome you once again to one more session of our 11th Congress at Abave and Combatri. We've had important panels so far, so I would like to begin by voicing my thanks to each and every one of you who took part in our debates. Thank you to our main speaker for this session, Professor Fernando Reimers from Harvard University. Thank you to Manuel Palacios and Claudia Costin, who will also pose their comments after Professor Reimers' presentation. I want to thank the Directory Board from above, Kalina Akati, our VP, Newman Fontanivi, our Director, Ricardo Primi, Priscilla Albuquerque, one of our directors as well, the Scientific Board, Adolfo Calderon, Alicia Bonamin, Maria Inês Filho, Reinaldo Fernandes, who has coordinated UMBA3, Bob Van Hein, Ruben Klein, and Professor Neto, former president of ABAV, as well as the Fiscal Board, Gislene Jesus, Leandro Martino, and Wagner Rezende. All of them were truly important and played a pivotal role for the organization of this event. I also want to thank the organizing committee, everyone who's working backstage, the Sens Gran Rio Foundation, CAED Foundation, the Lehman Foundation, the Itaú Social and Itaú Educação Foundations. I mean, thank you to all of these institutions who have truly provided us with the support we needed to make this happen. Vanzolini Foundation, thank you too. This is one of the sponsors of this event. So thank you to all of our partners and sponsors. Thank you to our team, special thanks to Silvia, Thais, and Leandro, who've been fully engaged in the organization of this event, and thank you to the Vanzolini Foundation team. With that, I would like to hand the floor over to dear Professor Fernando Reimers. He will be giving us a fantastic talk on education and the new challenges that we have in the post-COVID world, or during the pandemic even, as we try to get back to normal. So thank you, Professor Fernando Reimers. It's an honor for us to have you here. Thank you. Thank you, Maria Elena. It's a great pleasure to be here today. Now I will switch to English, okay? I don't mean to torture you with my terrible Portuguese. I learned this from Manuel Palacios only.
With you, the first Congress of Abave that I attended was in 2009 at the invitation of Manuel. And I remember what a wonderful time we had and how important this community of people interested in assessment is to the development of education in Brazil. So I'm delighted to be with you this time, even if it is online. I'm going to share my screen simply so that I can support my presentation. Can you see my slides today?
And what yes, we can, Professor.
I know that you are all exhausted. This is the end of the Congress, and I hope I'm not going to put you to sleep, but I'm going to go fairly quickly. The basic topic I want to talk about is how do we move forward? We have spent 18 months talking about the pandemia this, pandemia that, and learning loss and all of that. And I think it's time that we talk about, okay, what are we going to do going forward, given where we are? So let me begin that story with a short reflection, which I'm going to call, there are prophets in this world, and they may even be your friends. Back in February of 2020, I was having a conversation with a colleague of mine at the School of Public Health. His name is Rifat Atun, and I told him that I was very excited. I was going to travel to Mexico to present a new book. And he said, you're not going to travel anywhere, not just during the spring break. You're not going to travel anywhere in a year or two. And I said, why, Rifat? He said, because this virus you've been reading about is going to spread. It is going to become a pandemic. And airplanes and airports are really bad places to be during a pandemic. I can tell you that Rifat has become my personal guru. I now take his advice on what kind of mask to get, what kind of air purifier to have in my office, and so on. But anyway, when he said that, this is the book I was going to present, which was translated to Portuguese by Caede. And I'm going to talk about this book at the end of my fala today. This is a book on how to educate global citizens in schools. This book is a result of work that I've been doing with colleagues in a number of different countries, including Brazil. Claudia Costin, who's with us today, in what is called the Global Education Innovation Initiative, which is basically a consortium of colleagues with the goal of advancing understanding of how to educate students for the 21st century. And we advance that mission doing three simple things. We conduct applied research, we convene informed dialogues, and then we develop practical tools that can help teachers figure out what do we do differently. On the applied research, we have conducted 10 different studies, many of them translated to Portuguese, some of them translated to Portuguese thanks to our ongoing relationship with Caede, which now goes back, I realize, 13 years, 12 years. The informed dialogues, which I'm going to talk more about, are really exercises to make visible the knowledge of practitioners for the goal of improving education, and in particular, improving the work of education leaders. And then lastly, we've developed practical tools really in the form of curriculum aligned with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. I'll come back to those because I do think that one of the ways in which we can build back better is go back to this idea of how do we make education relevant. But to go back to my friend Rifat, you know, when he said, you're not going to travel anywhere, my first thought was, so how am I going to teach? How am I going to do research? Back in February of 2020, all these things seemed impossible. In hindsight, I realized they were not impossible. We did find ways to teach. The students haven't complained too much. We actually learned a lot of new ways to teach. And the same, we found ways to do research, a lot of research. Actually, by suspending all my travel, I think I have written more the last 18 months than I have the last 10 years. But let's go back to COVID. One of the things that I did immediately was to reach out to colleagues in a range of organizations and ask, how can we be helpful? And one person who replied right away was the Director of Education of the OECD, Andreas Schleicher, who said, let's talk. He said, what do you think we should do? I said, I don't know, I think we should do a survey. We should do an assessment of education leaders to see what plans do they have in place, what challenges they anticipate. It was so interesting to go back to the report of that survey, which we published at the end of March of 2020, because people knew 18 years ago what was going to happen, 18 months ago what was going to happen. They knew that a large percentage of the kids would be left behind. They knew that inequalities were going to increase. They knew they didn't have the capacity to teach when they couldn't meet in person. And many of them didn't have a strategy. As we began in April of last year to discuss these findings, we realized we were going to become the prophets of doom. We really didn't have any good news to bring to people. And we said, we have to do something else. And so we said, let's actually look at the people who are doing something interesting, people who are trying to educate, obviously very early. I couldn't call these things evaluation, but really documentations of efforts to teach. And we began to write case studies. I mean, case studies is a very pretentious word for what we did. We wrote short mini cases, caselets, 7 to 10 pages each. We produced in 3 months, 53 of them. And our goal was simply to capture what was happening and to share that information quickly. Andreas tells me, we put those on the website of the OECD, that it has been, to this day, the most consulted web page in the history of the OECD. So that tells me, you know, talk about evaluation, documentation, research, that sometimes this kind of quick and dirty research in a moment of a crisis actually can be very useful, that there is demand for this kind of knowledge. And I had a chance to go back the last few months to those 53 case studies. We're now going to produce a book because I analyzed them with the benefit of hindsight, asking the question, how much innovation did they represent? And it was pretty interesting that if you examine them in a very compressed period of time, these 53 practices demonstrated, irrespective of how effective they were and whether they prevented learning loss and so on, represented considerable innovation in very short period of time at a moment of crisis. Anyway, so this is a website where you can find these case studies. I think you may find going back to some of them now interesting. At least it has historical value. In May of last year, we did another survey and we said, let's see what's changed. And one of the findings of that survey, to our surprise, is that a lot of good things were happening, that no one was sitting on their hands just waiting for the sky to fall, but people were trying all kinds of creative things to continue to educate. And in general, their assessment of their efforts was very positive. Now, you might ask, but how come we had all this learning loss if all these things were very positive? And I think here the question depends on what's your counterfactual. Is your counterfactual the world before the pandemic? Because we didn't have that luxury. The reality is that we had a pandemic. The counterfactual is, what if we had done nothing? What if we had just waited, the way some countries actually did? What if we had done nothing? How is the effectiveness of what we attempted? How does that compare to doing nothing? Not how does that compare to the world before the pandemic? Because even though none of us wanted to have a pandemic, we didn't choose to have a pandemic, that was the reality. It's like we had an earthquake, or if we had a big meteorite hit the earth, that was the reality. Anyway, I realized in doing that work that the question of leadership was very, very important then, and did a few things. I call these things informed dialogue, essentially trying to make visible what the people who are solving problems know. And so we invited a range of ministers, including Minister Rosselli in Sao Paulo at the state, municipal, national level. And I asked them a few questions, very similar to questions I had asked people who had led reforms, again, at the municipal state level, ambitious reforms, and which we had published in the book called Letters to a New Minister. We followed the same approach, but the focus here was about the challenges these leaders were experiencing in the pandemic. And what was helping them? What did they find helpful and what did they need? So we used that to promote some conversations and then did two other exercises, again, looking at the question of leadership. Then more recently, I engaged with my graduate students, connected them with education authorities in various countries over a 4-month period, looking at how the pandemic had impacted education, what the government had done, and the results of what they had done, and we published that in that book. And then more recently, the Organization of Ibero-American States devoted a special issue of their journal, their education journal, to the pandemic. And I edited that issue. So we put out a call, I think it was in November of 2020, we put out a call for research articles, and we didn't know what we were going to get. We got 156 articles, which is a record number for the number of people. When you look at the last 5 years, is the highest number that they have received. So much so that I had to talk to the Secretary General of the OAI and said, look, these articles are wonderful. It would be a huge mistake to only publish one issue. So I could get the permission to do a double issue. So we could publish 19 articles. You might find it interesting that there was an overrepresentation of articles from Brazilian universities. I found that very interesting. Of those 156 articles, I think something close to 40% were articles submitted by Brazilian universities. And in the journals, at least half of those two journals are written in Portuguese. So that's interesting because it tells me that in this crisis, the university community, certainly in Brazil, but in Latin America more generally, has actually used the power of research to try to investigate what is happening and to try to be helpful, to try to provide knowledge, to provide evidence that can guide decision making. These are two recent publications. The one on the right-hand side will be published in 2 weeks, so it's not out yet. But the one on the left is basically a series of comparative case studies of the impact of the pandemic on 13 different countries, and a couple of them are overviews. One of them is Brazil, done by Claudia Costin and her collaborators in CEIPE. It's a very interesting story because what it shows is that, when people talk about the impact of the pandemic, you hear this narrative as if it's a single story. And what this book shows is that this is not a single story at all. That the two most important factors that mediated the educational impact of the pandemic are your passport, what country you're in, and your social class. This pandemic absolutely augmented the influence of inequality, which of course was greater in some systems than in other systems. So it's not a single story. It's not even a single story in Latin America. It's not even a single story within states in Latin America. And the journals that I just showed make that evidence, and this book also makes that evidence. Well, what is the bigger story? You all know it by now. If I had to summarize it, we are in a context of new austerity, less money for governments, for individuals, tremendous health impact. I don't think we really have comprehended, assimilated the health impact. I'm not just talking about 226 million people who have been infected in the world. Is that for everyone who has, of course, only 6 million of them have died. If you look at excess deaths, maybe that's another 4 million. So maybe 10 million have died. It's a big number. Relative to the world population of 8 billion, it's a small number. It's a smaller proportion than the pandemic 100 years ago, but it's still a fairly big number, 10 million people infected by this plague. But what I think is more important is that when you get infected from COVID, you know that you can die. And so that means 226 million have entertained the thought during the last 18 months that they could lose their lives. And if you think that for every person who's been infected, at least there are 3 people who are close relatives, that means 1 billion people have experienced the existential pain of thinking they may be at the end of their lives. And I don't think we have begun to understand what impact did this have in life and what impact did this have in education. I mean, really, who is ready to focus on learning mathematics when they think they can die, or when they think their father could die? Or they think a child could die. So the impact on health is something we're going to have to study more carefully. In this journal of the Ibero-American, of the magazine of the Ibero-American states, 2 of the articles are on the impact of teachers, very interesting, and especially on the gender differences in the impact of teachers, the impact on women teachers of this pandemic. The articles are Argentina, and I think another one on Mexico, has been brutal, in part because women have shared a disproportionate burden of this pandemic in their homes as well. And so I think we need to pay a lot more attention to the impact that this thing has had on the well-being of people, students, families, and teachers. Then, of course, there are the multiplier effects of this pandemic and other challenges, which I'm not going to talk about. But there are also some potential dividends of this pandemic, some good things that have happened. And I want to emphasize them because I think that they have tremendous implications for the evaluation and research community. And I'm going to come to that soon. I think that the dividends are, the good things, the glass half full, are that we've all rediscovered that yes, math, science, and language is important, but well-being is also important. Nobody learns very much when they're afraid. I think we've realized that science and technology really shouldn't be optional, but they are a necessity to participate in the 21st century, right? People shouldn't think that wearing a mask is a political preference, but it's just following the advice of the health authorities. And I think we have discovered how powerful the technologies that we're using today are. And we've also realized how much we need to learn to use them well for education. I think there's a whole new attention to the idea of partnerships between families and schools. And I'm hoping there is more appreciation of the work of schools by society, and more appreciation of the power of all kinds of collaboration within schools, between schools, and other institutions. This book that's coming out that looks at what 20 universities did during the pandemic is so interesting to see universities in many ways looking at this crisis as a moment to reassess their mission, to reassess their purpose in society, to begin to do the kinds of things that CAERE has been doing for so long, but which are in general exceptional for universities. And that is to basically connect the university to the rest of the elementary and secondary school system. Well, more universities did that. And I think it's worth asking the question, are these changes here to stay? Has this pandemic created on the part of the leadership of the university an awareness of how necessary it is for them to become much more interconnected with elementary and secondary schools. I think we've seen the value of the collaboration among all kinds of people and partnerships. There are these 11 ideas that I think are going to be with us for a while. And of course, evaluation and research can help us refine these ideas, can help us go from these ideas to the practice, the idea that we should develop a breadth of skills, that we should develop the capacity of young people to have a sense of purpose, to have a sense of autonomy, that we have to develop an ethical foundation, that we have to prepare people to deal with ambiguity, with the unknown, that deeper and continuous learning are the name of the game. We need to personalize, that project and problem-based education are powerful, that for that we need high quality curriculum and pedagogy. We may need to rethink the division of roles in the school and the very profession of education. We need to build the capacity of schools to learn from experience, to innovate, and then we need to build more connecting tissues across schools. This little book, which I wrote at the request of the International Academy of Education and of UNESCO, synthesizes everything I've learned on the impact of this pandemic into a practical guide for education principles and authorities. And again, thanks to CAED, this book is available in Portuguese. You can find it here. This book, by the way, is now being used in an entire state in India to develop like an operation manual based on the book of what do these things mean in their context. There's a group doing something similar in Mexico. There's a group doing something similar in Colombia. And I think that you're going to see in a moment that 1/3 of the recommendations of this book have to do with assessment, but not only assessment of student knowledge and skills. So I'm going to come to that. Big message of this book is we need to change the narrative. A lot of the narrative that I hear about the pandemic at the moment is about, let's go back to life the way it was in schools before the pandemic, and let's recover learning loss. And I think that those two ideas are wrong. And I'll explain why I think they are wrong. We have been living under this crisis for so long that we may be developing a very romantic view of what schools were like before the pandemic. And we forget that schools before the pandemic, half of the kids didn't learn how to read, and that the schools weren't teaching kids things that they needed. I mean, the reality, the reason why so many kids had a very hard time learning independently is because they didn't have the basic skills to learn autonomously. The schools hadn't produced that. So to just reopen the schools and go back to where we were is not actually going to help us face the crisis that we have of a world with greater poverty and inequality. Yes, we do need to reopen schools, but we need to make sure that they function a lot better than they were functioning before. And this notion of recovering learning loss, I think is misguided because many people are interpreting that as, well, let's take all the content that the curriculum was trying to teach them, and let's figure out a way to stuff that content as quickly as possible into the heads of the students. And that's just not doable. I mean, Colombia has 12 different subjects in elementary school. How do you stuff 12 subjects, the equivalent of 2 years worth of content in 12 subjects into a year or 2 years, when you also have to keep up with what goes next? It's not possible. So I think we need to replace this notion of remediation with a notion of acceleration, with a notion of, let's actually think about what are the competencies that we had. What were the standards that we had for each grade in terms of competencies? Brazil is in a very good place because you had just gone through this huge exercise of rethinking your competencies for each grade level. So you know what they are. What you may need to do differently is figure out a curriculum, an alternative curriculum that can help the students develop those competencies in less time, thinking differently about the use of time. So basically, that's what this book suggests. This book says, you know, we have to understand, number one, this pandemic is still here, and it may be here for a while. It's an illusion to think that the pandemic is over. So one of the things we need to do is we need to make sure that students learn a whole lot more now than they were learning the last 18 months. Increase the effectiveness of whatever we are using. Number two, of course, we have to recover capabilities, right? Number three, we have to build systems that are more resilient because, as a recent report said, we don't know if this is going to be the last pandemic. We don't know if this is going to be the last event. And furthermore, if we have realized just how important digipedagogies and the capacity to learn digitally is, let's just bite the bullet and do that right now. So to me, what that means is let's build blended systems right now, like tomorrow, which involves some component of remote learning, some component of in-person learning. I'm not saying that if your school day is 4 hours, you take 4 hours and divide them, two in person, two online. Use your 4 hours in person if you can do it, and add 2 hours online. Why? Because you need the extra time. You need the extra time to build those competencies. If you use online, you can personalize a lot more than you can in the classroom. And if you're going to build the skills for students to learn independently, they better learn to learn online. So this is something we should have been doing before the pandemic. We now realize we need to do it. And if you build that system now, you can dial the online component up and down depending on where we are. Let's say we have another terrible outbreak because another virus develops. Well, now you have the kids who can learn online and you can move more online. Now, to do those three things at the same time, increase effectiveness, make sure you recover capabilities, build a system that is more resilient, we need to do three things. We need to assess how the world has changed. I'm going to say a word about that. You need to develop a strategy to teach right now, this blended strategy. You have to increase capacity. So what is it that you need to assess? A lot more than student knowledge and skills. The first thing we need to assess is student well-being and, yes, learning readiness. Are they ready to learn? And how are they doing? We need to, of course, in the platform we have built, we need to figure out who's engaged with the platform. One of the beautiful things of the online platforms that were developed, I know that Caete was working with Sao Paulo in an online platform, and every student has an account. So now you have a lot more information than you had before about who connected, for how long, what did they do. We need to be analyzing that information because we may be on the verge of having much better metrics of actual student engagement and learning than we had before. Before the pandemic, if a kid was in the class, that's all we knew. We didn't know if they were paying any attention. We didn't know if they were daydreaming, if they were following the lesson. We just knew they were in the class. But when you have information on what happens in the platform, you know what they access. You know for how long they access. If you ask them some questions, you know if they're paying attention. That's what we should be moving towards. We should be having that kind of information. Of course, we also have to assess how our teachers and staff, how are they doing? How are they doing in terms of their lives? Are they ready to teach? How many of them are burnt out? What do you need to do so they don't quit the profession and we don't have a major crisis having to find 20% new teachers because people give up? We need to see how communities have changed because, as we know, this pandemic has not affected every community equally. In some places, you have concentrated foci of infections, of poverty, of increasing criminality, and we need to see, every school needs to know, how did my community change? So they can figure out, how can I do something that's relevant? And then we have to assess, how is the education system operating? What kinds of things were put on the back burner we didn't do? Building a blended education strategy, I think that there is much we could all learn from Portugal. In that book that looks at 13 countries, maybe not their accent, not their sotaque. Brazilian sotaque is better. But Portugal had a strategy that actually prioritized supporting all learners. And it seems to me that every decision that they made was responsive to that strategy. And so that's what we have to do in a strategy. We have to make sure no one is left behind. Second, we have to develop this hybrid platform. We have to reprioritize the curriculum. I mean, 12 subjects make no sense. Focusing on actual outcomes, competencies, and on educating the whole child. We need to be looking into accelerated learning. We need to be supporting the mental health and the emotional well-being of everybody. Back to this notion, 220 some million people thinking that they could, at some point over the last 18 months, that they could die. We need to know, are you okay? Are you ready to learn? What kind of help do you need? We need to support the mental health and emotional well-being of people. Assess, this is very important. We need to assess what innovations have taken place. I'm going to devote most of the rest of my talk to that. And then, of course, we have to integrate services. And to do that, we have to increase capacity, which to me means maybe we need to re-engineer the definition of roles, even the definition of a role of a teacher. If we want schools to do something differently, maybe the job descriptions we have aren't the right job descriptions. For example, if attending to the mental health of the students is an important issue, how do we deliver on that? Who does that? Who's responsible? Where is that capacity? How does that fit into the definition of the work of a teacher? If partnerships with families become a lot more important, where is that in the role descriptions of teachers and so on? And I think in general, this re-engineering, this redesign of roles in schools should be thinking about promoting teamwork. I think that there are very few organizations in the 21st century where we expect individuals to perform miracles. You don't think about public health as the work that where a teacher is going to perform miracles or a little hospital is going to perform miracles. Public health, you understand you have teams. You have teams in a hospital, you have an infrastructure, you have hospitals connected to universities, connected to industry. But in education, I still think sometimes we believe that these little schools and these heroic teachers in their classroom can perform miracles. And I think it's time we say, this is a beautiful romantic idea, but it doesn't function. It doesn't produce a lot of quality. We need to re-engineer how this work is done. Of course, we're going to have to build the capacity of teachers, of leaders, and so on. And we have to invest in designing systems that make it possible for people to learn all the time. Partnerships are one great way to do that. The reason I'm excited about the fact that some universities discovered that they can be part of the solution is because I think they can solve the problem that we have when we expect schools, which are very small, have very limited capacity, to meet all these demands of the 21st century. Now, what a school may not be able to do in isolation, a network of schools connected to a university, that's a whole different unit of analysis. And it seems to me that, I think it was Einstein who used to say, you cannot solve a problem using the same way of thinking that brought the problem. And to me, the scale at which we try to solve problems is very important. So this notion that we need to increase the capacity of schools by connecting them in networks, connecting them with universities, I think holds a lot of promise. Then, of course, we have to do a much better job engaging the family and engaging educators with family, and then work on networks. Well, so that's what that book says. I'm not going to spend more time on that. I was basically going to explain why we need to do that, drawing on data from tallies that basically show that before the pandemic, teachers were great at lecturing. They were not great at engaging students in teams, in solving problems on their own, and so on. But because we have little time, I'm not going to show you that. I trust that you all know what I'm talking about, that the universe of schools was very imperfect before the pandemic. I want to conclude with two simple suggestions. And the suggestions are, I've talked about these challenges and so on, that this may be the time. It seems to me that education, when it activates the intrinsic motivation of students, can produce extraordinary results. And if there is one thing that we know, well established in research, is that when a student understands how what they are learning connects to things that are important to them, and how what they're learning connects to things that exist in the world, which the students see, you get a very different engagement than when students don't see those connections. And I think this is what we need to be doing. We should have been doing that before the pandemic, but especially we need to be doing this now because essentially we're asking more effort on the part of everybody, of students, of parents. So if we're going to ask for more effort, they need to know, is this worth it? Why am I doing this? And one way to know that it's worth it is to say, because it connects to things that really matter to me, that are important, and it connects to the problems that I see are happening in the world, many of which have been made worse by the pandemic. And I think that these sustainable development goals are one way to do that. You all know what these SDGs are. They represent a vision that we badly need of a world where everyone belongs. And there is a way in which one can take those goals and use them to define what are the competencies that a student should learn. And because you already went through this exercise in Brazil of developing your competencies, you can do an audit, you can do a quick revision, and then schools can basically take these goals and design learning pathways that are project-based, that engage students in active learning, that help them see the connection between what they learn in the school with the outside school. And that's what I've done with my collaborators in the past. And I won't say these books are available in Portuguese. And I think they show just an example of how to do what I'm talking about. So this is a curriculum, 350 lessons. I will not be talking about this curriculum because Maria Elena is getting a little nervous here, realizing that I'm talking for so long. And then this is another curriculum also available in Portuguese that basically provides teachers in a very simple way, in 60 lessons, a way to engage their students in active learning. So I'll give you an idea. The Ministry of Education of Chile took these 60 lessons, they integrated them, put them on a website, every teacher can use them. They began to build communities where teachers are now expanding their own lessons, which, by the way, is one of the things that we can do in this pandemic. We can use We can use technology to make it possible for teachers to collaborate, developing instructional materials. One last thought. I think it's really important as we look at the future that we try to produce change, not by telling people how terrible the world is, not by reminding people that the sky is falling. We all know that. But by building on strengths, by identifying the good things that have happened in this pandemic and using that to transform the system. And I believe in every school, in every municipality, in every state, there have been good things that were learned. And it's important that we take the time to figure out what they are, to document them, to make that visible, and to use that to mobilize these innovation people and to remind people that we have the capacity to transform the system. I'll give you two examples. In Colombia, an organization like Encerramento for Brazil, Enseña Brazil, put together 500 teachers and in 3 weeks developed an entire curriculum, elementary and secondary schools on the radio. In Vietnam, the country organized all the schools and in 1 month produced an entire curriculum in television. I'm not talking now about whether it was effective or not, but to think that you can organize all the schools of one country. Each school takes a unit, and in 1 month you develop an entire television. This is something that had never been done before. And we need to make visible right now for everybody that such kind of change is possible. I am very concerned that as we go back to normal, administrators are going to push us back, and that this discourse that we need to go back is going to say, let's erase what happened in the last 18 months, and let's go back to the wonderful world we had before the pandemic. I want to conclude, it was not a wonderful world, and we shouldn't erase what happened, because there is a lot that we can learn from what we did in the last 18 months. Thank you very much.
Fernando, muito obrigada. Nós nunca nos cansamos.
Thank you very much, Fernando. We can't get enough of you. It's always great to hear from you. Thank you.
Maravilhosa. E com tantas
This
pesquisas.
was a wonderful presentation. You've published so many books, so many articles, and we're always mesmerized by your work. I will hand the floor over to Claudia Costin because she has to leave a bit early. We don't really have to introduce her. I think everyone knows her. So without further ado, well, she's a professor at the Getúlio Vargas Foundation. She's the head of an important institute. Claudia, I forgot the name of the institute you run. It's the Center for Educational Policies from the Getúlio Vargas Foundation. Good, Claudia, so over to you. Take it away.
Maria Helena, agradecer à diretoria da
First and foremost, thank you to the Abave Board of Directors. Thank you to Manuel Palacios, Elena Katia, and above all, the great master, Fernando Reimers. I see that Reinaldo Fernandes is also in the room. It's great to see you. Well, to begin with, I would like to pose some comments on the presentation by Professor Reimers. Fernando explicits some temptations that we should avoid, one of which was made very clear by him. You know, we've got some losses, things were terrible in the past, and we may be tempted to think that we have to recover those losses. We don't want to use that word because we don't want to get back to the levels we were before, considering the high levels of inequality that were made worse by the pandemic and considering the learning crisis that we've been going through since 2019. We want schools to reflect our real position. In 2019, our figures were not as good as 2017, but we're way below global standards. Now, the second thing Professor Fernando mentioned that is really interesting is that we shouldn't deny those losses. And this is very important because some research in Brazil may be misleading in that regard. studies that say, let's not talk about learning losses because they didn't happen. And then they start using some poetic language saying that we should go back to something and that we should not correct that. I mean, these losses happened. That is a fact. The issue here is not to recover what was lost, but we want to make use of this suffering. We want to make use of this sad situation that we're still going through in Brazil, by the way, Fernando. The situation has been made worse because of institutional issues. This is not only an economic and sanitary crisis we're going through, we're also going through an institutional type of crisis, which is very severe. And in some cases, our capacities in education have been dismantled in the federal level. So this is a sad situation. Now the issue is, should we make use of this sad situation and then look at the legacy that was left by the pandemic? Positive legacy, I mean. And there are positive elements, I must say. And of course, one of which was made clear by Fernando. He showed us that either way, we've got this large number of teachers that was exposed to a new way of teaching. That is to say, they had to handle the digital world, but they went beyond that. They actually started seeing themselves as people who would make sure classes would happen. They were not sheer providers. We got tons of options of digital classes online. There are different platforms out there, but only professional teachers may make sure students learn by making use of those platforms. That's why when it comes to blended learning, I think that is the proper way to go. Now, Professor Reimers also mentioned something really important and quite provocative. We should develop institutional capacities. During his talk, it was made clear for us, and during the pandemic, we all realized how fragile our non-existent system is. If we are to give a response to COVID from an educational standpoint, I can tell you that we've seen great experiences in the country. I mentor 50 municipal secretaries and 3 state secretaries in Brazil. And I mentor these people myself. I've seen great and beautiful experiences that people have been developing. However, there's been a total lack of articulation of our educational response to the COVID-19 situation. And we are not actually looking into equity. There is no equity in our educational system, and the educational response to COVID was extremely unequal. That is to say that in a country such as ours that already shows deep educational inequalities, well, the educational response was particularly cruel to those who are most vulnerable. I would say response was sort of unacceptable towards those people. Professor Reimers touched on so many topics. I won't get back to all of them because I want to leave room for Manuel Palacios to speak. But another topic that stood out was the issues regarding higher education and science and technology. The pandemic allowed us to see science being developed on the go. Technology was developed on the go. No one knew what the virus was about. We got responses really quick. And we saw these responses coming about because they had to come about swiftly, and universities proved how valuable they are.
Isso vai estar sendo
So
profundamente.
those who are unaware of all of those things will be very unfair towards universities. They were under attack, those universities, and we were very ideological in our approach early on and during the first half, so to speak, of the pandemic. And I am not going to mention any names, but yes, I should say that yes, they were under attack, universities, and that was very unfair, and they responded. They excelled in their response in terms of research, vaccines, and they noticed that certain propositions coming from government authorities were senseless, and authorities actually changed their outlook towards basic education, primary education. And there's something that, well, Marilena represents fully to me when it comes to primary education and the National Council of Education and its role, the key role it plays. Looking at the lack of coordination from the Ministry of Education, there's a lack of, and sorry for being so candid and talking about polarization and bringing politics to this forum. But if it weren't for the National Education Council with all that it has actually comprised, all its responsibilities, our response in terms of education would have been more unequal. I think this is the correct term. The National Education Council actually rose to the challenge that we are faced with now and have been faced with, and also looked at the following dimension. It has reviewed the teaching profession and the national core curriculum, as Fernando Reimers mentioned, and it supported us throughout this period with online education and looking at the different, reviewing the priorities in the curriculum more lately. And we have come to realize that, yes, we need to change the focus when it comes to the teaching profession and continued education. And the Head Starts have to also consider digital and remote learning and has to, of course, make the necessary changes in education for the 21st century, looking at social emotional skills and competencies. Teachers who have not developed their own skills will not be good educators. And we will therefore not go back to 2019, but rather at least to 2022. Thank you for your attention. This is all for now, for my part. Thank you very much, Claudia, for your inputs, for your remarks. Excellent remarks. And yes, you've touched on key points and pointed out, well, important things that were mentioned by Fernando Reimers and issues that we are actually facing in Brazil and living in Brazil. I'll turn it over to Manuel Palacios now. Over to you, Manuel. Good evening. I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me, to thank Maria Elena and Katia and the board of Abrave for giving me the opportunity to sit in this panel and to be part of the 18th meeting of the association. It's amazing to once again have the opportunity to be here with Fernando Reimers, with whom I've had the opportunity to collaborate and to learn for so many years. And as mentioned earlier, we've collaborated for 13 years. So yes, we go way back. And it has always been a fruitful relationship. And I've learned much at a professional level and in our interactions. Claudia Costin, it's also an honor to be with you in this debate. Marilena, thank you for inviting me and for the opportunity to have taken part in so many debates throughout the pandemic. Yes, of course, we've also had many opportunities to share experiences. I would also like to say that this conference put together by Abavi has actually highlighted an agenda consisting of research that is very much in line with all the concerns that have been considered, that have been presented earlier. And we need to look at assessment and consider the pandemic and post-pandemic times. And well, Fernando began by stating that some positive effects could, well, we could maybe actually have some positive effects from the pandemic. We will value integral education, science and technology. We will value the relation between schools and families. We will value partnerships and cooperation more. And I would like to introduce the following concept to this list. I fully agree with the fact that, well, a crisis will always bring about opportunities. We should not stick to the past and idealize the past and be nostalgic about the past. But the pandemic in Brazil, of course, we had major losses in learning and as we have, of course, identified, children have lost much when it comes to education throughout the pandemic. And maybe if, yes, we are further valuing schools and education in a certain way, we couldn't have on-site learning physical. Children would not go back to schools, and now maybe they will reopen. Schools will reopen, of course, considering the safety protocols, but I am not convinced that, well, one of the key topics in research is to learn how much we actually value education and, above all, school education, because schools have been closed for 1 year and 8 months now. So maybe if we consider going back to school, not immediately, but maybe some months from now. And civil society demands for schools to reopen and for schools to actually have support families by reopening. And there have been protests for schools to reopen, and you have, of course, institutions that need to work and to be able to operate. And I don't know, I'm under the impression, you might agree or not with me, that the Brazilian society throughout this period has not demonstrated, has not had the necessary, inevitable appreciation and acknowledgement of how important education in schools are for the new generation. So yes, this is something I'm unsure of. And of course, Claudia also mentioned that acknowledging losses is important. Also, of course, to bring about innovation and to adopt innovation in education. I would say more research is also key, and it's also important for civil society to make their demands. Civil society demanded for schools to close down. Not all students could actually have access to remote learning. And as we are all aware, you have, of course, increasing inequality because part of the population had no access whatsoever to remote learning or any other alternative propositions. And what is striking to me, well, is the minor reaction from civil society, considering all of these facts. And well, this is what I have to say. These are my comments on the topics that Fernando brought to the debate. And I would say that the different reactions from civil society in different regions nationwide, well, different groups reacted differently. And I have the impression that our society, civil society did not actually rise up to the educational challenges that we're facing. And I remember that not long ago, we were working and collaborating with a group from Harvard. I think Marilena was present in the meeting that was held in Salvador with professors from Harvard. One of them raised his hand and said, I read a survey according to which 80% of families say schools are great. Why do you think schools will change? Why would they change? I think you were there. Fernando, Maria Elena was present in the meeting. It was a long time ago, but I'll never forget the question. Why would schools bother to change if parents are saying that schools are doing a great job, as they are fulfilling their mission? And these would be my remarks. And well, going back to Abavi and to this meeting, the agenda is very converging, very much converging with Fernando's concerns. We are not to be nostalgic. We should rather value and focus on innovation and how we have actually risen to the challenges of the pandemic. And as a recap of all that has been discussed in this meeting, well, when it comes to assessment of activities and remote learning, well, this is a fact. This is a given. Hybrid or blended education is also now a reality. You have new technologies that are being used in assessment. And in fact, we are not totally sure how we're going to handle all of these factors. And these were topics that were discussed in this meeting in many panels. How are we going to manage blended education going forward, looking at the objectives, the goals with a wide range of options that schools have access to now. And of course, these are key topics, and of course, they have nothing to do with nostalgia. We are actually looking at how we're going to handle the resulting complexity stemming from innovation and looking at differences, variation. It's also important to note there were discussions about training, and we tend to compare development and the educational processes over a period that is extended over time or over the primary education period. So the latest experiences I've been following closely of the CAED and training education. Well, first, I should say that with the pandemic, we had a growing demand for activities that would be carried out, seeking to train students, to support students with learning, and that was unprecedented. That was novel, and many different states and municipalities also required and claimed for innovation and wanted to keep up with all that was being made available, seeking to produce data in order to improve intervention and throughout the pandemic. And with this broader formative education, many challenges arose and came to the fore, came to the surface. First, we maybe could ask, how are we to create measures that can cope with this process that is extended over time and seeking to track progress and what has been adopted in teaching education. We can talk about vertical scales, about AI and assessment, about digital assessment in different contexts, and these are important matters. And I have the impression that they're converging with the concerns that were expressed by Fernando in terms of the legacy of the health crisis we're facing.
Outro tema que eu gostaria de citar toca
I also like to touch on another topic, which is quite important and was mentioned by Fernando. How can we rethink the relation between teachers and students, or the relation between schools and students? With new formative education skills and by making use of new technologies and new approaches to bring students closer to the schools, what has been made clear to us is that the relation between students and teachers is a requirement for any of our strategies. The classic scenario of external assessment, in which external assessors would go to school, collect data, and then bring them back to schools, is something that did not really work during this period. On the contrary, formative education depends 100% on teachers' adoption and support to make those tasks happen, not only to give meaning to those tasks, but also to build commitment on the students' side, considering their learning path. In the state of São Paulo, Minas Gerais, and Rio de Janeiro, these are the cases I know the best. Well, these cases question assessments and tasks using different technologies. We see students doing homework in school, in their homes. They may use mobile apps, they can use their computer browser, they can do stuff in paper, they can do their activities at home. And the final result of all of that is that teachers and principals are the only people who can articulate or make all of these possibilities happen. Now, assessing the results of all of that, which is the main topic of this Congress, is something that is no longer at the hands of the institution only. Educational systems will have access to these results, but this is dependent on a shared responsibility amongst universities, schools, teachers, and different managerial levels in public institutions. I believe this is a very relevant topic considering our experience over the past 1.5 years, and we can see a close relation to the concerns and diagnosis that was made by Fernando during his talk, as well as the opportunities of collaboration in this new scenario. Well, this is what I wanted to say. I think we should look into those topics if we are to handle these important topics. We believe all of them are intertwined, and they're also connected to this international agenda on what is to come after this crisis. I don't mean to say post-pandemic, but after this health crisis we've gone through, what can we expect? I could go on about other topics. I could talk about high school assessment, professional assessment. I could talk about flexibilization, flexible contents, but we can leave that to another opportunity. I believe I'm one of the last speakers of this event, so once again, thank you very much. This was a great opportunity. That's it. Back to you, Maria Helena. Thank you, Manuel. I believe Manuel talked about a strategic topic. Why didn't the Brazilian society complain? Schools were shut down for a long time. There was no complaint. And I agree with you, Manuel. It's impressive. I mean, the press, media outlets, rich and poor families tended to think that it was better not to open schools. Now I have a question for you. Older students do not want to resume their classes, especially private school students. They don't want to go back to school because they love studying at home. They have a laptop of their own and they don't really want to get back to in-person classes. And it's funny, last week I partook an online seminar with professionals from northern Brazil, from Paraíba state. And in Paraíba, 8th and 9th graders do not want to get back to school. They've got 10 or 12 students per class because students prefer to stay home. They can do written tasks, they can communicate with their teacher using WhatsApp. They don't really want to get back to in-person classes. So, Professor Fernando, we're now going through critical times in Brazil, and your talk was fantastic. Number one, because the school will not be the same as it was before the pandemic. We now have different challenges. Now, we have to understand why the Brazilian society does not really appreciate the fact that we should go back to school. I agree with Manuel and I agree with Claudia. Inequality skyrocketed. Research shows that already. Roscielli, the Secretary of Education from São Paulo, was actually asking, can I really abide by the Constitution and demand all our students to go back to school? I think so. If you look at the contamination levels, well, this has been managed in the state of São Paulo, and the Constitution states that classes are mandatory. So I believe we can get back to schools, but we can't have the majority number of votes in the National Council, in the National Board. Some states are resuming in-person classes, but most of the Brazilian states are not going 100% back to classes. They will only do so by early next year. Some of these students, some of the states have 50% of their students, some of them a little bit more, but there is no pressure. I mean, no one puts pressure on that. No one really wants to get back. Even in Congress, there hasn't been such a debate. We're not talking about this tragedy and how terrible it's been for us to have schools shut down for such a long time. Well, everyone's been vaccinated. I mean, most teachers have been vaccinated already, but still we find resistance. So we're trying to understand why that happens in Brazil. People are not appreciating in-person classes. Even economists, Fernando, they did not appreciate that. And that makes me, I'm impressed because for our future in Brazil, education is of the essence if we want people to socially develop and to economically develop as well. But people do not ask for that, as they should. Also, Fernando, I wanted to hear your comments on another important topic that we discussed thoroughly at Abave. During the pandemic, those who work in schools, I mean teachers, coordinators, principals, have actually opened their eyes for formative assessment, the use of new technologies to assess students, so that was quite positive. It was positive from education professionals' standpoint. I was talking to this Campinas University professor, and as I talked to her, I realized that even universities that were quite resistant to new technologies and to their use in classrooms have done away with that. That's really interesting. And I wanted to hear your thoughts about that. This great gap that we see. On the one hand, teachers who've always resisted to use technologies now appreciate this use and they're open to that. And on the other hand, we've got the Brazilian society. I mean, rich and poor people alike now don't even really want to get back to in-person classes. They don't really put pressure on anyone to make that happen. So what are your thoughts on that?
Es muy interesante. I'm sorry. It's very interesting to hear this idea that society did not put a lot of pressure to return to schools. And I think it's worth investigating why. I would not immediately assume that the reason people were not in a hurry to come back to school is because they don't value learning. I could suggest that maybe they don't value the kind of learning that schools make possible, and that the pandemic gave them the freedom, gave them the opportunity to learn different things. Now, I don't know if this is true or not in Brazil, but I think it's worth doing a little research in understanding what were the students doing during the time when they were not in school and what did they learn, and to complement the justified concern over learning loss with research on learning gains, by which I mean not just how students did in assessments which are designed against the curriculum, but more broadly, what did they learn during this period? For example, I have thought that maybe this pandemic provided the greatest possible lesson in civic education because it made so visible the inequalities in society. It made so visible the great suffering that many people were experiencing that I have to wonder, did that sensitize an entire generation to these problems of inequality? I don't know the answer, but I remain open-minded that maybe there is something that students learn from this moment that is positive, that is going to be positive. I will give you an example. Obviously, it may or may not be relevant, but in a class I teach at Harvard on education policy, last week, our class was about the pandemic and the impact on education. And one of the things I did in preparation for the class is I asked the students to put on a website their own reflections about how the pandemic had impacted them and what they had learned. And what I observed is that a considerable number of students had, as a result of this pandemic, decided to work in education. These were people who were working in the private sector, who were working in commercial activities, who were so shaken by this pandemic that they decided to shift careers. I was not expecting to see that. Now, this is a small group of students, it's a class of 70 people, so maybe there were 10 people who made that shift. But the point I'm making is that we should study with an open mind what impact did this moment have on students. And the fact that they don't want to come to school doesn't necessarily mean that they don't want learning. I mean, we know from the history of education that some of the most progressive educational experiences clash with schools. You remember the famous Summerhill experiment. Students were given a lot of freedom. They develop a lot of valuable skills. And when those students enter regular schools, they had all kinds of problems. They hated it. But that was not a problem with the students or with the skills. That's a problem with the schools. Same in Colombia, you know the program Escuela Nueva, which does give students more agency, more freedom. There is some evidence that when the students from Escuela Nueva enter regular high schools, they have all kinds of problems because their teachers try to teach them in a way that doesn't give the student any freedom, that is so regimented that the student rebels. And that's what I mean by when I said we shouldn't have a nostalgia for going back, because some of the things that were happening in school before were not good. So the students definitely had more freedom. Maybe they wasted their freedom doing video games. I'm not even sure that's a waste. Maybe they wasted their freedom, I don't know, watching television, doing something useless, but maybe during that freedom, they actually discover things that are useful for them. They actually learn, they actually experience what it was to pursue an interest in a way that the school normally doesn't allow them the opportunity to do. I remember years ago doing a study of how Chile had introduced technology in schools. This is like 15 years ago. the Enlaces program. And I was fascinated that the classrooms that were introducing technology were clashing with the school, because the people who were teaching technology were not your traditional teachers. They came from schools of engineering, and they used very different pedagogy. They were telling the students, you can study any topic you want. We're going to, and this is not something that happens in schools normally in Chile. Students don't have any freedom to study any topic they want. And the consequence of that was a huge clash of cultures between this more open student-centered pedagogy and the traditional pedagogy of schools. So all I'm saying is we should study these things. But I wouldn't necessarily make the assumption that Brazilian society doesn't value learning. Maybe they don't value the kind of learning that schools support, and maybe some people have a reason not to value that. Maybe there are some things that schools have been doing which are not so good and that we shouldn't bring back. I don't know.
Eu, sinceramente,
Well, I sincerely believe that, yes, we need to further investigate this topic. It would be really important to maybe conduct a survey, because families were afraid. And, well, okay, students don't want to go back now because they might now prefer to stay home to learn on their own. They might have developed other skills. Maybe they think school is boring and the curriculum is completely out of line with reality. So they might have their views. And at the same time, I believe that families can, well, in a way or another, have, well, be fearful. I feel that the Brazilian society is facing an institutional crisis, as we've heard here today, a major crisis, and people are fearful. They hear all kinds of information, fake news are all over, and they become true. So there are things that get in the way, I would say, and that actually produce a different reaction. So it's something we need to consider further and study further. But what's really important here is that in your research, you show us that, yes, there's a legacy, inequality will continue, will deepen, but there's also an important legacy. There are legacies that will contribute to, well, maybe they will help us actually recover, but it will take time. It will be long before we recover, and for students to recover, to pick up, and considering an environment, Fernando, where we need to prepare, set up a new seminar. We need to set up a new seminar on the changes in Brazilian education. We have the Common Core, the new high school system, and the changes that are actually being considered now, and with all the assessments that are happening. And all of these things are happening in a very strange environment, so to speak, to say the least, a very weird environment. So yes, we will have to overcome many challenges. And next year, early on, we'll have to begin to deploy and to track the new high school system. We need to conduct a survey and about this new system starting in February next year. By law, well, there is a regulation according to which schools need to implement the new high school system early next year. We are not sure whether it will happen or not, but anyway, since you have a breadth of research that you have produced, and you have a team, many people that have been conducting research with you, Maybe you can support us in the process. You will be a valuable partner that will also bring important questions to this process, to this research process. And also, well, we'll have to look at how students will come back to school, how schools will come back. Anyhow, I'd like to thank you for joining us today and for your contribution. All that you have produced has been so useful for us in Brazil. Your books are being used in public schools and private schools as well, and have been actually supporting this debate of reopening schools. Thank you once again. I would also like to thank you for always being available and ready to discuss the problems we're facing in Brazil and to really try to understand Brazil. You are someone who, well, you're very familiar with the challenges we face in Brazil. So both you and Schleicher and Red Schleicher are two internationals that are very familiar with Brazil, that have been actually following Brazil closely and have greatly contributed to, well, with all of us here in Brazil. And maybe we can say that, yes, what we are, this context in Brazil now can be provocative for those who are studying education, the learning system, and aiming to understand it. And Lina, Reynaldo, maybe I can turn it over to them for the closing remarks. Once again, thank you all for joining us. Lina? Well, wow, I think that first and foremost, I think that Abavi is now closing a cycle of debates, extremely important debates, and articulated with curriculum, assessment, school reopening, civil society. And I think that, yes, Abavi has, over these last 3 days, played a very important role, bringing all these discussions to the table, and also has produced important indicators and highlighted important indicators that seek to bring stability to this very challenging moment we're living in. I liked what you said, Maria Elena, and I would, well, in closing, like to express our gratitude to all of those who helped us put this event together. We've had over 500 participants following us, important discussions with managers, teachers, scholars, researchers that actually were here with us. And well, we actually at Abavi, fortunately, were able to play this important role for the Brazilian education in Brazil. Thank you once again. And well, we'll be together again. Hopefully, we'll have an on-site meeting the next time. Maybe we'll have a ball. We'll throw a ball, have a party. Yes, definitely. Reynaldo, over to you now. Yes, I'll be very brief. I would also like to thank everyone. Well, we've been together for 3 days, and things actually went very well. I think, well, we didn't have any previous experience. You see, Fernando, we're learning on the go. And we had, this is the first time we've had a remote meeting, a webinar. It all worked well, and we're closing now. Well, the best possible way. Fernando, thank you for your lecture, your brilliant lecture. Thank you, Fernando, and thank you to all who actually joined us and participated in the meetings, and those who helped us organize it. And thank you, Marilena, and I like to congratulate you for coordinating this event as the president of Abavi. Thank you, and I would like to adjourn by thanking all of you who, well, stuck with us throughout these days. I had the opportunity to participate in many panels, the vertical scale, theories, roundtable, well, with Lina. Yes, I had the opportunity to follow many of the debates, top level debates. I think Abavi has played an important role and has contributed to education in Brazil in these challenging times we're living in. With all research, we had over 75 projects that were submitted by students that were presented, and there were debates on them. We had participants from the Netherlands, the USA, the UK, Chile, Spain, France, and well, many countries, Germany. So, well, I should say that yes, we had very constructive and relevant debates. And now, well, we feel that we are prepared to keep on working from Abavi and supporting assessment and education in Brazil. Now that schools are reopening and after this long period, and also reviewing assessment in Brazilian schools with the new Common Core, Brazilian Common Core, and the new high school system. And also had discussions about the new regulatory system for superior education in Brazil. Brunner from Chile joined us. You know Brunner. So there were many rich discussions, important discussions for education in Brazil in the short and the long term as well. And as always, well, you closed on a high note, and it's been a very important participation. Thank you so much for being with us and for your joy. And you are always so joyful, and you encourage us with your words. And thank you to all of those people who helped us organize this meeting, this remote meeting. It was the first. I couldn't even sleep at night, but fortunately it all went well, and it was a great success. Thank you to Lina, Manuel, Reinaldo, Lina as the Vice President, to Sylvia, who's always supporting us, Thais, Vanzolini Foundation. Thank you to all of you. Have a great evening, and we will actually call you soon, Fernando, to come back to talk about the high school system, the new system, before December, or maybe early next year. Okay? Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.